For as long as the French horn has existed, people have wanted to make it easier to play. It poses all sorts of stupid technical difficulties in hitting notes, maintaining pitches, range issues, all sorts of stuff, where you put your hand on the bell. And it started out with no valves, and so you just had a limited number of notes that were very hard to hit, and you had to stick your hand on the bell to change the pitch or tuning around, and it was just kind of a mess. There were all these crooks. And so when valves were invented in the early 19th century, all sorts of brass instrument makers got excited because finally there was going to be another chance at making an alto voice brass instrument without having to deal with the French horn itself. And so, yes, there were valves put onto what would eventually become the French horn, but there were a lot of different other attempts from different makers. In the mid to late 19th century, musical instrument companies were coming up with all sorts of different concepts in brass, and part of it was that they were all fighting for patents. They were trying to get each other on a pretty thin market, and so you could go to a company and find their own version of what brass should be in their own families. Adolphe Sax invented his sax horns and the saxotromba. There were a lot of other companies all around Europe and in America that did wacky things, like when the Henry Leonard Company had the whole family of Centennial model horns that went around your neck like a toilet seat. Then you had stuff like the altophone, the cornophone, the Roth corno, and those are all longer subjects for different videos. But what I want to talk about today is the weird little niche of alto brass instruments that are basically trying to make a horn alternative for inexperienced players or younger players, or just people who don't want to deal with the French horn and its many problems. And so when Sax invented the sax horn, there was an alto voiced instrument there, which still survives to this day. But most of the other ones are extinct. And there were ones that were shaped like French horns in hoops, with the bells pointing that way or that way. You had just piston horns, but you also had things like that altophone I mentioned. It's made by an American company. There was something called the tenor core. There were a few others. Sometimes you just had alto horns in hoop shapes. There's the post horn with valves on it, and distinguishing that from all these others is another thing. But there's one in particular that had a strange span of life beyond this kind of period, because most of those instruments just died out after the late 19th century because people weren't buying them. And that instrument that I want to talk about is the mellophone. Now, that word is probably familiar to you as a marching instrument, something that kind of looks like a trumpet, like this, but with a gigantic novelty stupid bell on the end. One that's actually so tall that it's going to cover the face of the person playing it and probably the rest of the instrument. It's like a trombone bell on a big-looking trumpet. And those are known in marching bands, in outdoor music, usually at sporting events. High school bands use them, partially because they point forward and, French horns point backwards, and that causes a problem for not playing indoors. Now, there are marching French horns, which are pointed like that, but have the tubing profile and everything of a French horn. So mellophones are not like that. They are actually properly pitched as alto instruments, as if you took like a trumpet principle and put it into an alto voice. And that's all fine and good, but those are developments from an earlier mellophone, and they look like this. As you can see, this has that hoop shape, but it's got piston valves, and I'm playing it with my right hand. So this is basically the same thing as an alto sax horn in terms of the length of tubing, very much like the width of the tubing. As you can see, it starts out, gets a little wider here, but then stays mostly cylindrical, even through the valve section. It's basically the same length, same width, same width, same width. And then around here, it starts to get a little wider, a little wider, a little wider, a little wider, and then you get the really big bell at the end. So most alto horns that you see like in brass bands don't have this really large flared bell like this. And they have a bit more focused sound, even though having a bit more of a conical tube profile. But this was invented originally in the late 19th century and they had a sort of period of popularity in the early 20th century as a horn replacement. Basically, you can imagine your middle school band, and you've got someone who doesn't really know what to do with this, and they definitely don't think they know what to do with this. And so but they do play the trumpet. So you figure, well, if they play trumpet, they can do this. And so let's just stick them into an alto voice instrument. Now, alto trumpet is an extremely rare instrument, and it's not usually very desirable as a blending and harmonization instrument. You have to be very specific about how you use it. But this was on the market, and so it started getting used as a horn replacement in schools. And that went fine and well for a while, but then about the 1950s or so, their popularity went and they basically stopped being made by 1970. And the reasons for this I don't really know all of them. Student horns made these days are really quite reliable, and there's an increasing sort of professionalization of amateur music, where certain kind of either hybrid instruments or in-between things, stuff like this, is going to get crowded out by basically lower cost official instruments, like 3-valve euphoniums or very cheap student trumpets, that sort of thing. So that remains the question of what is this and what do we do with it? Because there are scabs of these online. If you go on eBay right now, you'll find a few dozen of these for sale. Reverb, there's a bunch of them, but nobody really knows what to use them for. Now, it's not going to sound exactly like a French horn because it isn't a French horn. French horn has a pretty specific sound that comes out of the fact that it's basically an F tuba's length of tubing that is got a much narrower, tube profile and a really, really, really little mouthpiece. And this is much more cylindrical. So it's going to sound more in the trumpet bugle kind of range. Does this do all of the notes that a French horn does? Mostly, but you're going to miss the notes in between about the written F sharp below the staff and then the C under the staff. So you're probably wondering what key this is in. Well, these came in usually in F and E flat, and you had slides that could switch them between the two keys. There were rarer models in D or C or B flat, and then there were all sorts of other things in the 19th century like the ballad horn and the vocal horn and the solo horn, which were similarly like this but in different keys and sounded a little bit different. But those are all long gone and I don't have any. So this particular one was originally sold with F and E flat tuning slides. The tuning slide being on the back here. It's this big curved thing. Now, guessing by how crumpled up this is, you'd be correct in guessing this is the E flat slide. I do not have the F slide. This particular instrument I found at a thrift store, and it didn't have the F slide with it. And I paid fairly reasonable price for a used obsolete instrument at a thrift store. And I'm not really in the mood right now to buy another one of these, if I can find it, just to get an F slide, or to get one with an F slide and then throw this in the trash. So right now it's permanently in E flat. Otherwise it's complete. However, it did not come with its original mouthpiece. Now the shank on this is the same as a trumpet shank. So originally I was just putting a big trumpet mouthpiece in here and getting a very trumpety sound out of it, but that wasn't very kosher. Thankfully, James Hampson of Hampson Horns sent me this very old Mellophones mouthpiece for free, which is very nice of him. His shank doesn't quite match, and so I put some masking tape on there to kind of get a seal out of it. But otherwise, you've got something that looks very much like a horn. It points the other way. So you're playing with your right hand and it's pointing down like this. And it's got a very different kind of mouthpiece from a French horn. But it's not that far off when you think about it from, say, a trombone mouthpiece or a trumpet mouthpiece. It's a very parabolic, kind of in between the two. I would say it's got sort of a sharper edge like this, but a big, wide, flat thing like that. Which gives it a very dark sound. It's a very round sound. It's, I would say, maybe full of overtones, if that's the right term. And Also, if you're going to get one of these, I highly recommend getting one with these canted valves. You can see how the valve section here is tipped a bit off from the main tube. A lot of these will have them straight up from the tube, which basically forces you to either point the instrument straight down to the ground, which is stupid, or if you have it pointed like this, to have your hand, at this really odd angle, which is pretty bad ergonomics. So you can find one with the canted valves. That's great. And many companies did make these with canted valves. Pan American was one. Martin Handcraft is one. And obviously you're dealing with 100-year-old instruments, but you can find one with canted valves that works. That's what I would recommend. Now, this particular instrument is by Olds. This is an Olds Ambassador brand mellophone. And you can see Ambassador right there. The date on this by the serial number is from the 1960s, which is late in Olds' company's lifespan. It's also in the last generation of this kind of mellophone. And I should say this kind of mellophone, but really I need to give you the straight name for it, which is the concert mellophone, or the classic mellophone. Marching mellophones are an evolution from this into a different context. So why haven't these stuck around? Again, it's largely for the professionalization aspect, but also composers just never found a way to like this. I would say French horn gets its power partially from its distance, from the edge inside of its voice, that kind of cutting feeling combined with thinness. When you're up high, it has a certain tension to it. And speaking to someone about this issue, he said that he had always heard that the real essence of sound beauty in music is tension. And something like this, you're going to hear, is filled with a few too many overtones to have a lot of tension in it. So compared to a French horn, that's very, it's not exactly the same thing. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, but it is very different. I would say, sound-wise, this is kind of like an alto flugelhorn. Those do exist, but I don't own one to compare. But if I had to say, it's like a flugelhorn, or some sort of other sort of in-between kind of alto instrument. Like if you had maybe an alto trombone and made it a lot woofier, you'd get something like this. And you can change the sound. Now, French horn, because of the giant bell and its history, has a couple peculiarities. One thing you do is you end up sticking your hand inside the bell. Most horn players will end up with a position kind of like this, but that's dependent on an instrument with a larger wrap. If you look at this, and if you're familiar with French horns, you'll see that the wrap is actually quite small. This was built with younger players in mind, and because it doesn't have as much tubing as an actual French horn, they can get away with something that's very circular and doesn't take up a whole lot of space. That being said, for someone who's my size, I'm 5'8", 5'9", getting my hand in there and not getting in the way of the sound with the rest of my arm is kind of awkward. Getting your hand in the French horn bell anyway is kind of awkward. But you can kind of stick your hand in here somewhat and change the sound. And I'll demonstrate that. And that cuts out a lot of the overtones and gives you a little bit more of a focused sound. When you have your hand totally out, you can bend the partials around and be wah, 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 wah. With this, it cuts a lot of the other vibrations in there and gives you something a little more focused, which I like. You can also stop the note. And stopping in French horn lingo is just making a fist or something, or blocking all the sound off, and it makes this kind of noise. So I can stop it with my hand. That doesn't sound really great in that passage, but you can do effects if you want to, like, and it does change the tuning in the same way that a French horn would. So in that sense, this particular model is actually a good training instrument to transition someone to a French horn from, say, a trumpet or baritone, because it has a lot of the same attributes, but they're fingering with the right hand still, and if it's a child, it's a smaller instrument. It's not as heavy, which is helpful. This particular instrument is actually very heavy walled because those old ambassadors were built like tanks, but in general, it's going to be less heavy than a normal French horn. So if you have the right mouthpiece and everything, it is an option for having someone do an F horn part or an E flat part in that range without all the problems of the French horn. Because this has a trumpet kind of range, that means that the partials, as in the space between the notes that are of the same fingering, are a lot larger. You're playing down in more of a normal valved brass range, and so hitting notes is much easier, which I find very convenient. Overall, would I recommend this? Yes, but I think it needs a little more exploration before I can safely put it into compositions. I am planning on writing a couple of things for it myself, but if you're a composer looking for a different kind of brass instrument, you can write for this, but just be forewarned, they don't make these anymore. The reason I brought the date up for this is because this represents the terminal state of the classic mellophone. They stopped being made by any company, as far as I know, about 1970. And there are a couple of companies that will make things that are either exactly like this or very similar to this. Mellophones makes something they call a Waldhorn, which is actually the closest thing I've seen to horn for dummies that I've ever seen. And it's like, the same kind of principle. It's an E-flat alto instrument with this kind of tubing, but it's rotary valves and it's left hand. So you get the function of this without all the problems of the French horn. I also spotted on eBay some Indian manufacturer was selling these new concert mellophones, but based on my experience and what I've heard of these Indian musical instruments, I really wouldn't recommend buying it. You can get an older one that's a lot more reliable, probably, for much cheaper. So that's what I would look for. I have come to really like this instrument. It was used in Seattle middle schools and high schools in the earlier part of the last century, probably in the 1960s, 1970s, and now it came into my hands just because it was very cheap and I was curious. And now that I have the proper mouthpiece for it, I can really see what it's like. So let's just end this by playing a little bit of music.